Man, this was a really good NFL Sunday. We had some overtime thrillers, we had some big time comebacks, and aside from a few games, a lot of them were really close and came down to the wire. But there's one game in particular that I want to start off by talking about, and that's the Chargers versus the Titans. And the big question I have for the Chargers is, are they contenders or pretenders? Because based off of the first 2 weeks, they look more like they're pretenders than actual contenders. Now, there is a lot of football to be played. There's still many weeks for them to figure it out. But I just really don't think Brandon Staley is a good coach. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's fired midway through the season, especially if the Chargers end up losing a couple more games to start the season. Because when you're a team that has Super Bowl aspirations and you start off 0-2, there's got to be someone to blame. And I really don't think it's Justin Herbert. I mean, he did all he could to keep them in the game against the Titans. Now, I guess you could blame the defense because the defense hasn't been looking great. Now, granted, they did play the Dolphins in week 1, and then they played a pretty good Titans offense in week 2. But I think the blame mainly needs to go on Brandon Staley. I haven't liked him as a head coach since he's really gotten there. I mean, I feel like they've underperformed since he's gotten there. They made it to the playoffs last year, but were part of one of the biggest chokes in NFL playoff history when they let the Jaguars come all the way back from that big deficit to win the game. And a lot of people were calling for Brandon Staley to get fired then. But he came back this season and the Chargers have been underperforming. So if I was Brandon Staley, I would be counting my days. But now actually moving on to the game versus the Titans. I mean, I think the offense looked pretty good. I mean, they couldn't get the run game going at all, but they were missing Austin Eckler, and Joshua Kelly, who had a big game in week 1, did not have a big game in week 2. He just looked like he could not get a solid run at all. I mean, he had 13 attempts for 39 yards, which ended up being a 3 yards per carry average, which isn't great. They also tried to get Elijah Dotson going with 4 attempts, but he couldn't get anything going either. Isaiah Spiller also got involved a little bit, I remember, and he didn't really do much. So all in all, the run game was just atrocious, so that put a lot of weight on Justin Herbert's shoulders, and I mean, I think he did really good for what he had. I mean, Keenan Allen went crazy. The Titans could not guard him. He had 2 touchdowns. Mike Williams also played good. But if you don't have a run game, you become really predictable. And I think towards the end of the game, that's when the Chargers really just couldn't move the ball, like especially in the overtime drive. I mean, that just looked ugly. And as far as the Chargers defense goes, they played really good for about a quarter and a half. I mean, in the first quarter, I'm pretty sure Ryan Tannehill had like 0 passing yards. But then the Titans passing game really got kicked off once Ryan Tannehill threw a bomb to Treylon Burks. And I think that was just the beginning of the end for the Chargers' good defense that game. Because once Treylon Burks had that catch, then DeAndre Hopkins, Chigakonkwo kind of got going. And I think once the Titans really get their pass game going, Derrick Henry and Tyjae Spears are just going to start eating. And that's kind of what happened. And speaking of Tyjae Spears, I mean, in the first quarter, it seemed like Derrick Henry and Tyjae Spears were going to split the carries, but then Derrick Henry started to get the bulk of the carries. But I think Tyjae Spears needs more than just 8 carries a game, because Derrick Henry had 25 carries compared to Tyjae Spears' 8, and Tyjae Spears almost doubled him in yards per carry. So I think it should be more of like a 60-40 split between them two, because I think Tyjae Spears is legit. And not to mention Derrick Henry, I'm not going to say he lost a step, but he definitely doesn't look like the Derrick Henry of old. So I think Tyjae Spears should get a few more carries, a few more targets, because I think he's going to be the future of the Titans running game. But just to wrap things up, I'm not going to go as far as to say the Chargers are pretenders, because it's only week 2. I feel like weeks 1 and 2, and maybe even sometimes week 3, are kind of just games that test the waters. You don't want to overreact too much. I mean, the game we'll get to eventually is the Bengals versus the Ravens, and the Bengals have also started 0-2, and have probably looked worse than the Chargers have. But I'm not going to sit here and say that Bengals aren't going to make the playoffs, and I'm also not going to say that the Chargers aren't going to make the playoffs. I mean, the AFC is a crowded conference, and it's going to be hard to come back from an 0-2 record, but I think it's possible for both teams. But I don't want to overreact too much, and the Chargers have a somewhat easy game against the Vikings, who do look like pretenders. So I think if the Chargers lose next week, then we can start talking about if they're pretenders and if they're even going to make the playoffs. But for now, I'm just going to stay level-headed and kind of just see where this team takes us. And speaking of the Ravens and Bengals game, that's what I'm going to talk about next. And in the beginning of this game, Joe Burrow still was struggling. I mean, it just seemed like he couldn't get anything going, and it looked like the Ravens defense was just smothering him. But then the later got into the game, the Joe Burrow from last year and the one that we really know kind of started showing up. And he ended the game with 222 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. But I think for Bengals fans, they're just excited that Joe Burrow finally kind of came back to being the real Joe Burrow. Now, I'm pretty sure he did re-aggravate that calf injury that he had at the beginning of the season and through training camp. So I'm not sure yet how long that's going to keep him out for, if at all. But with a calf injury and hamstring injuries and things like that, they're kind of like a pain in the ass to deal with throughout the whole season. So that's going to be interesting to see. As far as the Ravens go, they looked really good. Lamar Jackson looked better passing wise than he did last week. And I mean, Zay Flowers just looks legit. He's probably looking like the best rookie receiver. Well, actually, no, I'm wrong. Puka Nacua is looking like the best receiver, but Zay Flowers is looking like the best round 1 receiver. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens win the AFC North, just because the Bengals have had a slow start and they've already beaten them once. Moving on to some of the rookies that stood out this week. I mean, I think you got to talk about Bijan Robinson. It just seemed like every time he touched the ball, something special happened, and he's already looking like a top 5 running back, which is what I predicted before the season started. But it's just really nice to see him destroy defenses, even a good defensive line in the Green Bay Packers. And then in the Colts-Texans game, it started off as being a rookie versus rookie quarterback matchup with Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud. And Anthony Richardson looked really good, especially with his feet. I mean, he had 2 rushing touchdowns, and it looked like he was going to go crazy against the Texans. But on his second touchdown run, he got tackled in the end zone, and he kind of whiplashed his head, and his head hit the ground really hard, and he was ruled out with a concussion. So then Gardner Minshew stepped in, and he played all right, nothing special. But on the other side of the ball, CJ Stroud looked amazing. I mean, he was dotting up that Colts defense all game. He ended up with 384 passing yards and 2 touchdowns with no interceptions. Now, he did get sacked 6 times, but if CJ Stroud, a rookie quarterback, can drop back 47 times for 384 yards with really no great receivers. I mean, his receiver number 1 is Nico Collins, who had 146 yards and a touchdown. But Nico Collins isn't a wide receiver 1 by any means. He might be a pretty solid wide receiver 2, but once CJ Stroud gets a wide receiver 1, a bona fide one, I think the Texans could be really scary in the coming seasons. And then another rookie that you just have to talk about is Puka Nacua, which is probably the rookie that has jumped out of nowhere, at least on most people's radars. I mean, he was targeted freaking 20 times against a great 49ers defense, and he had 15 receptions for 147 yards. He still has yet to get a touchdown, but man, those targets are coming his way. I think it's safe to say Matthew Stafford has found his new favorite target, with Cooper Kupp being injured. And the Rams almost pulled out the W. I mean, 30-23, but I just think it's going to be hard to stop the 49ers with that potent offense and amazing defense. And then the rest of the games, I'm just going to kind of run through pretty quickly. The Bills had a bounce back win against the Raiders, and Josh Allen bounced back big time with 3 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, which is key for Josh Allen's success. The Bears are looking just terrible. I don't think Justin Fields is their franchise quarterback, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is his last year in Chicago, at least starting. And the Buccaneers are surprisingly 2-0. I mean, Baker Mayfield is looking really good. He's doing just enough to get the victories. He's not wowing anybody with his amazing play, but he's doing just enough to get the victory behind that really good Buccaneers defense. The Seahawks get a bounce back win as well in overtime against the Lions, which they probably shouldn't have won. I think the Lions kind of shot themselves in the foot, but I think both teams are really solid, and it was a really good game. The Chiefs versus Jaguars, one of the top 2 offenses, at least in my opinion, both struggled pretty bad, with the Chiefs clawing out a victory 17-9. I'll have a separate reaction out for the Giants versus Cardinals since I'm a Giants fan. The Cowboys just dismantled the Jets without Aaron Rodgers, and it's looking like that Jet season's probably over. I mean, that Cowboys defense is just looking insane with their insane defensive line and secondary. It's going to be hard to stop the Cowboys. The Commanders pull out a win against the Broncos, and really both teams were trying to throw this game away. I mean, the Broncos were up big in the beginning, and then the Commanders came back, and then the Broncos almost came back in the final minutes. But Sam Howell looked really good, and the Commanders pulled out the W. And then the Sunday Night Football game, the Dolphins versus the Patriots, was a pretty good game. The Patriots defense did a really good job against the Dolphins' amazing offense, but it just wasn't quite enough. And the Dolphins are showing that they can beat you in multiple different ways. I mean, last week against the Chargers, they destroyed the Chargers in the pass game, and then this week, they still had a pretty good game passing wise, but they really killed the Patriots on the ground, with Raheem Mostert having 121 yards and 2 touchdowns. So the Dolphins are looking very legit, and that offense is looking very, very scary. And that's going to do it for the Sunday recap. I'll have a reaction to the Giants versus Cardinals game a little bit later today, and then I'll also have a recap for the Monday night slate on Tuesday morning, so stay tuned for those 2 videos. And with that being said, I hope you guys liked the video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and maybe consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out a lot. And as always, this is the Draft Nerd, and thanks for watching.